Hi, I'm Dave Annell. Welcome to the 10th episode of Setting the Record Straight. This is the second of a two-parter in which I look at some issues relating to the early years of civil registration in England and Wales. In episode 9, I explored the frequently held misconception that registration of births was initially optional, and that it wasn't until 1875 that it became compulsory. I trust that having watched episode 9, you will now be convinced that it was always compulsory right from the start of civil registration in July 1837, or at least that was the intent of the legislators. In this video, I want to look at the issue of under-registration of births and to consider another popular misconception, namely that the number of births that went unregistered before 1875 represented a significant proportion of the total number of births in England and Wales. I've seen figures as high as 30% quoted, and even the usually reliable Mark Herber, writing in Ancestral Trails, mentions that in some parts of the country, up to 15% of births were not registered between 1837 and 1875. Well, my problem with this is that while the stats may be accurate, no sources quoted, it's misleading and it encourages sloppy research. Reading that sentence, the only fact that is going to stick in the mind of the inexperienced researcher is the figure 15%. Herber goes on to say that the position improved from 1875. The Registrar General, George Graham, no, not that George Graham, this George Graham, believed that the overall figure across the first 3 decades of civil registration was somewhere below 4%, and that the problem was mostly confined to the first decade, i.e. up to about 1847. Graham was fully aware of the shortcomings of the 1836 Act, and he was constantly asking for fresh legislation to be passed that would resolve many of the problems. It's absolutely clear that some births did slip through the net, and that, as with any new system, it took some time to get going. So it's not surprising that it wasn't until the late 1840s or early 1850s that the overall rate of registration began to approach something that could broadly be described as a comprehensive record. But it's this obsession with the 1874 Act that bugs me, and I know that it bugged Audrey Collins too. Back in 2014, Audrey recorded a talk for the National Archives called Early Civil Registration. I'll pop a link in the comments. And in the talk, she referred to Dave and Audrey's crusade to persuade people that this 1874 thing is all nonsense. Well, let me assure you all that in Audrey's absence, I fully intend to continue that crusade. Our problem with the 1874 thing was that if the Act really made all the difference, if switching the ultimate responsibility for ensuring that births were registered from the registrars to the parents meant that the problem of under-registration had now gone away, if 1874 represented such a great big line in the sand, then we should be able to see the impact of the legislation in the published statistics. But do we? So here's a table showing the total number of births registered in England and Wales in each year during the 1870s. And we can see, as we progress through the decade, a steady climb in line with a growing population. And then we come to 1875, and here's that great big line in the sand. And if what we're led to believe is true, if the 1874 Act made all the difference, we would surely expect to see a significant rise in 1875, the year in which it allegedly became compulsory for the first time to register births. But this is what we actually see. A small decrease in the number of births registered in 1875 compared to 1874. And as we go on through the decade, we can see it steadily climbs before, strangely, slightly falling off towards the end of the decade. Looking at these figures, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the 1874 thing is all nonsense. Of course, some births were never registered. That's a well-established fact, but your failure to find a record of a birth, whether before or after 1874, can usually be explained in some other way, most often because it was registered under a different name, or it occurred in a different place or a different time from whatever the evidence you had led you to believe. If your first thought is, oh, it was before 1875, so it probably wasn't registered, you're doing yourself a disservice, and you're letting your ancestors down. Keep looking. Think outside the box, and whatever you do, don't give up. Oh, and perhaps you'd like to join Dave and Audrey's crusade. Thanks for listening. I'll be back with another episode of Setting the Record Straight soon.